Welcome to Brandon Hall Group's Excellence at Work podcast. You will hear from industry leaders covering innovative, cutting-edge business, learning, and HR topics that weave current market research and technology into each episode. Our Excellence at Work podcast is hosted by Brandon Hall Group's Chief Operating Officer and Principal HCM Analyst, Rachel Cook.
Hello, and welcome to Brandon Hall Group's Excellence at Work podcast. Don't forget to subscribe. I'd like to warmly welcome Mehdi, the Senior Regional Director of EMEA from OpenSesame. Hi, Mehdi. How are you today?
Hi there, Rachel. I'm great. Thank you. Yourself?
I'm doing well, doing great here, and excited to chat with you about kind of some of the perspectives that you have from global challenges in L&D. So, and once before we get started here, just to share with our audience a little bit about you. You have Mehdi Tunsi has over 20 years of experience in the learning industry. Mehdi has successfully implemented learning and talent management strategies for various industries, including content providers and LMS platform specialists. And you've done a lot of interesting work with clients in learning and implementation of their technologies and strategies. And so, we were chatting as we were prepping for kind of our talk today about, what you're seeing from a global perspective, what's the new normal, what are some of the challenges, how do we balance everything? And so I know you have a lot to share. And before we start talking about our topic today, can you also from your experience, what is it like at OpenSesame? What's the culture like? Can you share with our audience a little bit about OpenSesame?
Yes, certainly. Thank you for that, Rachel. I'd say and I've been around longer than I'd like to admit, but from a company culture standpoint, it is probably the most inclusive and diverse by design organization I've worked with. And what that means essentially is that the environment that has been created really allows for that diversity to translate in high-performing team, a very agile organization, lots of ideas around how we can do things, how we can approach things. So for a learning organization, not only do we preach a lot, apply a lot of what we preach, but I would say one thing that I really love about our organization is that level of inclusion and diversity there is, and that's at every level. It's the people, the ideas, how we do things. And last thing, and please forgive me, but we discussed it before as we were prepping. As a Frenchman, I have to admit that's probably the least American company I have ever worked for. And I mean that in the nicest way, because before working for OpenSesame, I worked for a German organization, and then before that, I worked for another US organization. And typically, a lot of organizations there's a strong cultural influence based on where those companies. And I think OpenSesame, from that standpoint, is probably the least US organization I've worked with because of that focus on diversity and inclusion, and being open to other ideas and other perspectives, and allowing us on the EMEA side to be able to really impact our culture and who we are as an organization, and redefining that's part of the culture. So see, Rachel, you were asking me about OpenSesame. So I mentioned that I love the fact that we're a very inclusive and diverse organization in every sense of the term. And what that allows us to do is, on one hand, be able to create and foster a culture that is in one way unique, but on the other hand, very welcoming to any walks of life. And I love the fact that as an organization, we're not necessarily defined by the fact that currently a large majority of our colleagues are US based, and that we were started in Portland, Oregon, but it feels much more like a global organization, even though we're still fairly small.
That's great, and it really I think it helps, especially if you are serving global geographies and demographics. And even in the US, our companies are still very diverse, and our communities are diverse. Some areas may be more so than others, and some depending on where you are. However, I think that's why there's such a big push on diversity here in the US, is because we are such a diverse nation, and we want to ensure that our employees and our teams have a strategy to support diversity, and not just for getting people into the company that are diverse, but being, like as you mentioned, feeling included, feeling heard, feeling that you are part of the culture, and you're not separate from the culture. So that's really good to hear. And we've talked, or we're seeing a lot of this around the new normal. A lot of it's being driven by the pandemic, by technology, even before the pandemic. Most recently, we did a survey on transforming learning and development for the future of work. And we had 1/3 of organizations report that they feel their approach to learning is positioning them well to develop the skills they need for the future of work. That's only 1/3, so that is not the entire organization. So for those companies that are falling short, what are some advice, or what are you seeing as far as the new normal, and how can we get more companies feeling that they are, that they have the abilities to develop their people?
That's a good point, Rachel. I think we are at a great transition, because there's that divide between the learning. So I think that there's multiple factors. First of all, there's a real need for L&D to really be a stakeholder to the business and be able to demonstrate how they can impact the business outcome. And part of the reason why it's not always the case is because there's also that legacy, that learning, which used to be called training. And if we go back into even the etymology of the words, training came from the whole schooling system, the education, and that idea that essentially you're sat in a room and we're going to force feed you knowledge, and there's no notion of learning. And yet now we're at a stage where, because of thanks to technology, the pace of work is just insane. And in order to keep up with that, you need to have very agile employees that can learn in the flow of work. But up until very recently, learning was seen as something that you had to stop working to be able to go and do your learning. So the challenge, I suppose, for the L&D to be able to help the organization is demonstrate how they can impact the bottom line, but at the same time also demonstrate to the learners that actually learning is a natural part of work. You cannot work and not learn, and probably part of that is being able to deconstruct the traditional approach to training or learning, where we will sit you in a room and you're going to you have to be able to learn in the flow of work. And what that means is that we need to understand there's such a divide between how we live our lives and how we consume content on a daily basis. And a good example of that is if the both of us check the news this morning, and I will admit that in this day and age that might not be a good idea. Maybe you read an article, maybe I watched a video. The outcome is the same. The way we consume content is very down to our preferences. And yet, when you go to the workplace, you're told, no. We'll have a one-size-fits-all and everyone will learn in the same way. But the reality of the world we live in is that's not how people consume content. And that might be, maybe I want a video, maybe I want an e-learning module, maybe I want an interaction around the coffee machine. That's when there still was coffee machines, because with the new normal, a lot of people might be working remotely, or even if they have an office, they might not be in the office at the same time. So the challenge for L&D is being able to recreate those exchanges to allow for that informal learning to happen, but also to understand that learning is not set in one way. There's not one way of learning. And it's a constant that needs to be delivered through multiple means, whether it's technology driven, whether it's people driven, but it has to be delivered in multiple ways, and not how it's been delivered for the longest time. So I'm not surprised that 2/3 of organizations feel that they're not necessarily getting the most out of L&D, because if just to be the advocate of the L&D community as well, where before you had to focus on people and competencies, now you need to be versed in technology, you need to be versed in delivery, you need to be versed in so many different skills that you need to upskill and reskill yourself as an L&D practitioner to be able to help your learners. And I think that's the biggest challenge we're facing in a world that is constantly evolving. And then if I bring it to our perspective here, where it's quite global, the reality is that there's no longer any one size fits all. That worked in the past, but the reality is now if you're catering for groups of learners are in different countries, there would be also a cultural impact to how they prefer learning to be delivered to them, let alone the format. It might be the language, it might be so many other things that you need to take under consideration.
Absolutely. And, you mentioned a point about deconstructing the learning. So, what I've been seeing, sorry, my earpiece here, what I've been seeing is that, companies that are trying to redesign their learning and deliver it in different modalities. When they feel that they don't have to recreate it, they can leverage what they have. I think that also takes some ease off of some of the the strategy of it, and kind of figuring out what works in different types of technologies or different types of formats. Can more or less be easier done when they take and leverage what they have than having to figure out, starting from scratch for everything. Perhaps maybe some things, but a lot of what they already have can be utilized. And so I think that's what's good news about kind of, the innovation of it is kind of taking what you have, but, thinking about different ways, whether it's simulations or gamification or video chunks. So there's so many different ways that they can leverage it, and that's good news. And we've also seen there's this whether it's just coming out of the pandemic or a lot of the movement, especially here in the U.S. And I think it's not just in the U.S. It's impacting global with with the war that's happening, or the multiple wars that are happening in Europe and throughout. So with the Great Resignation and leading to the midlife crisis, or Great Midlife Crisis, what is your perspective? How do we move away from this
Okay,
mindset?
that's a tall order that you're asking, Rachel, here. So, I would say, but a couple of things. So, the all the things are happening outside certainly have a direct impact on our employees, on the population, the inflation, the war. I mentioned I'm reading the news, and that's why I said in this day and age, it's not the most exciting thing someone can do first thing in the morning, reading the news. The Great Resignation, and just to give some context to everyone. So last year we talked a lot about the Great Resignation and how up to 45% of the workforce were considering a new career, which I thought was very interesting. The Great Midlife Crisis is out of an article I read recently, in which it said that when the Great Resignation was coined, the demographic that was concerned was mostly people early in their career. That's the people that were reconsidering their options. And then it turned into what they call the Great Midlife Crisis, because that demographic has changed now. And we're seeing people who are seasoned within their job, they have a great set of competencies, like plenty of experience and expertise. They are also considering, well, do I do that for the rest of my life? Is it really what motivates me? Am I passionate about that? And as a result, drop their career. And the challenge that creates is that we have a whole bunch of highly qualified workers and employees that are leaving the workplace without any succession planning in place, without any opportunities to have anyone step up to the plate and not fit in their boots. And that's creating, on one hand, people starting into the workplace that need some guidance, and there's no one to guide them. On the other hand, people are halfway through their career and saying, well, I've had enough, and I've always wanted to, I don't know, be a carpenter, or whatever that might be, and I'm dropping as it is, and I'm going to focus on my passion. And obviously, a larger amount of people that are going into retirement without having a replacement for those people coming. So that's the challenge, but that's a global economical challenge. It's not something that we would be able to tackle as such just with L&D. What we can do in terms of L&D, and going back to your point, because I love the idea of recycling and using what we already have in house. It's not necessarily having to add multiple layers of new ways of delivered learning that will do it. It could be that a lot of, in fact, it's not. It could be a lot of the knowledge is already in-house. It's more a case of how do we get that surface so that it can be used by everyone, and what are the tools that will allow us to do that. And often the answer is like, how do we impact the culture? So there's more collaboration, more exchange between between people to be able to foster, like, better pass competency transfer and things of the kind. So I think the challenges are more around that. And then when you put it to the context of like people living the workplace, and we discussed that just before starting, but I think organizations, and now we're getting into that, start refocusing on the people. But for the longest time, the focus, and I think it was interesting, is I can't remember which one of the big four did a CEO survey every year. And for over 10 years, the top priorities of CEOs were innovation, R&D, new markets. And only in the past couple of years do we see people. People now are back on the agenda. And that's scary. That's scary thing that it's taken all of that we've gone through, especially the past 2 years, for organizations to realize that their best asset is their people, and investing in their people is probably the best way to thrive in the current economic system we're in.
Everything goes in a cycle. I think it was maybe in 2018, 2017, kind of a reoccurring trend in our priority survey that we deploy at the end of every year to gather what organizations are focused on and their key priorities and challenges. And people was like number one in all aspects of HCM. And I want to say that was probably for a few years prior to the pandemic. So now that people are, or companies are, seeing it's such a challenge, the war on talent. And if you don't have people or good people in place, most importantly, then it's really difficult to drive your business objectives. And what are you seeing? How do we fix, or what can we do about improving this war on talent, or ensuring that we have people in place and that they have the right skills?
Yeah, I think you touched on that, Rachel, in that the focus should be on people. So it no longer is about we have a ping pong table, and every Friday you get I don't know a paleo or keto lunch offered. I mean, that doesn't cut it. I think one of the probably more obvious signs of that, and we saw that firsthand at OpenSesame, is the focus on well-being, where for the longest time I can't remember like any corporate asking me about how do we deal with stress management, or how do we develop like counseling skills internally. That had in the past it was more, are we focusing on leadership, or maybe we're focusing on compliance. And now well-being in the broad sense. So that's things like stress management and like dealing with anxiety and counseling, and all of those things have become like key areas in which we see organizations investing for two reasons, to your point. One is to like retain the good people they have. How do we make sure like that our good people are not living because they're under too much stress, or because, and it might be stress that is created by work, but it could be also external factors. So how do we support them if it is the case? And then at the same time, in order to attract talent, is being able to demonstrate that you really treat your people well. And that's treating people as people. Again, it's not about, we've got like bean bags and a basketball hoop in the office. Because the reality is now less and less people are necessarily interested by the office. Maybe they don't want to go to the office. Maybe what they're interested in, there was you probably saw that Microsoft did like a test with a 4 days week in Japan, in their Japan operations for a while. Iceland did that for 3 years as well. And in Iceland, they saw an improvement in productivity of 45%. In Europe, Spain started. In the UK, there's 1,000 companies that have moved to like a 4 days week. I'm not saying the 4 days week is the solution. What is interesting is more around the freedom you allow and give employees to be able to manage their time as they see fit. So it's not 4 days week is, don't get me wrong, I'll take 4 days week tomorrow. I'll be more than happy to go for 4 days week, and I believe that we can and should work smarter rather than the harder. But then I don't want to get started, because I think that if you compare Europe to the US, especially, there's a very different ethos and work culture where in the US, there's still way too many companies where being first in and last out is worn as a badge of honor. And I think in Europe, for multiple reasons, there's a long, long time that people do not value that or see that as being a proof of someone who's a better employee. But there's still work to be done, generally speaking, for people to understand that if you can work smarter, and at the same time for organizations to understand that if you allow people the freedom to do the work they need to do as and when they want to do it, then it is a win-win solution versus what was it recently, one of the tech giants saying that they expect you to see everyone back in the office by a certain time. I doubt very much that that's going to pay off.
Right. Well, I think it'll be interesting because I think everything has its there's there we see a lot more companies, especially global corporate companies that are, slowly migrating back to the workplace. So it'll probably happen, probably in the next 5 years. And you saw what happened with Yahoo way before, what was that, 10 years ago, where everybody was working, or a good majority of them were working from home. And then the new CEO came in and said, we need you back because productivity is down. So there's a balance. I don't know what the right answer is at times because people are all different. And some people that are going to work from home are going to perform. And some people, if they're not in the right field and not in the right position, they may just kind of, flounder along. So, but we do need to, as leaders, figure out that right mix of flexibility, but still, being able to track performance and being able to talk about it and, set realistic goals and expectations. And some positions are easier to do that than others. Sales, you can easily see whether they're productive or not, depending on how you measure other areas of the business. You just had to be maybe perhaps a little bit more specific on what your goals and objectives are and timelines. So yeah, it'll be interesting, but I definitely agree about, the focus on well-being. We see a lot around, mental health and how that's being addressed in the workplace, from a positive and also negative impact when it's not addressed. And so it's become more acceptable to talk about issues like that, and so along with other disabilities and other areas that we may not have spoken about as openly 10 years ago. So as we wrap up today, Mehdi, we've talked a bit about the new normal, technology, the workplace, the differentiation from a global perspective and mindset. How do we give employees that autonomy, but ensure that they're still performing? How do we balance this work life, and is this a key motivator?
Well, I think it's it's, if it's not the key motivator, it certainly is an important one, because a few years ago there was an interesting book written by an executive at LinkedIn. I think it was called The Divorce, where he explained essentially how every generation after the Gen Xers were not committed or tied to their employer as the previous generations have been, and therefore that aspect of loyalty and I want to start and work for that company and spend the rest of my life does not even exist nowadays. I mean, my kids are teenagers and they're scared when I tell them how many years I spent in the same companies. Now, how did you stay that long? They can't even fathom that fact. So the reality is that we're in a situation where if you find good people and you're not able to offer them that right balance between being able to do their work and performing their work, but at the same time allow them to be themselves and lead and live their life as they see fit, there's very little reasons for them to say, oh, I'm sticking with you, and not saying I'm going elsewhere. I do not owe you anything. Sure, it is a two-way deal, and therefore my commitment to you is also translated in the result I bring to the organization. So I think work-life balance is going to be like that key differentiator. To your earlier point, is it going to be achieved just by giving 4 days a week or by saying you can work from home? That's not quite clear. I think what is clear is that organizations will have to like, demonstrate some flexibility and understand that for a whole set of reasons, some people might prefer working from home, other might prefer going to the office, and other might prefer like doing a bit of both. And to your point, people need to interact with people. I think one of the real thing that we saw during the pandemic is we are social creatures. We need to interact with other people, and as good or not it might have been for some to work from home, I know that the minute we've been able to go back to like in-person events just made a huge difference. And the fact that now a lot of the conversations, less so maybe now, but going back even a few months ago, a lot of the conversations, even when you first met someone on a Zoom call or Teams call, were to do with what are the restrictions on your end? Are you wearing a face mask? Have you had and it really came down to like that more human side of like who we are. And I'd like to think that that's where the focus is going to be in the years to come.
Fascinating. And it's about weaving your work and your personal and how that kind of meshes together. What is that right mix? Because in the past you just kind of had your work day, and then you go and you had your personal, and that's not the case anymore. Even if you go into an office, there are still sometimes things that you can't leave away, depending on your job, depending on what's depending on the importance of the task or the issues. So it's finding that that right balance of or that integration of the two. They're not separate. So it's got to work. It's got to work for the employer. It's got to work for the employee. It's kind of like a marriage.
Very much so. Yeah, like I think it's more. I don't think it's a marriage. I think it's more a companionship as such, because there's no, even though there is a contract, so that's right. Like a marriage. You don't have,
or it could be a variety of different ways of how you identify whether it's a marriage, a contract, a partnership. So yes, so it could be a mix of all of the above in what's your perception of a binding relationship
with the true. That's a completely different subject.
Right. I don't know. Before I get myself in trouble and not saying the right terminology, I think it's a good way to wrap up today.
That sounds like our cue.
Thank you, Mehdi. Thanks for joining me, and thank you everyone for joining us. Hope you found our discussion interesting as much as I have. And until next time, take care.
Thank you very much, Rachel. Thanks, everyone.